In a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with identical houses and carefully trimmed lawns, one home stood out in a way that drew both admiration and resentment. It belonged to Daniel, a man who had spent years cultivating a garden that wasn't just a patch of plants, but a living, breathing masterpiece. His yard wasn't a typical square of grass with two bushes out front. Instead, it was a carefully designed space filled with blooming roses, climbing vines, bursts of wildflowers, and handcrafted stone pathways that wound their way through beds of color. The garden had become his escape from the daily grind, a personal sanctuary where every flower told a story, every plant had its place, and every corner of the yard revealed a detail most people would have overlooked. Neighbors often slowed their cars just to admire the view, and passers-by would stop to take photos, sometimes even asking Daniel about his techniques. For many in the community, his garden was a source of joy, but not everyone saw it that way. The Homeowners Association, known for its strict rules and micromanaging board, viewed Daniel's creation as an eyesore. They insisted that every lawn should look uniform, neatly cut grass, a few shrubs, and maybe a small flower bed at most. Anything beyond that, they argued, broke the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. To them, Daniel's garden was not a masterpiece, it was a violation. At first, the HOA sent subtle warnings. A note slipped into his mailbox, reminding him of the community standards. A short email requesting compliance. But when Daniel ignored these, believing his garden brought more value to the neighborhood than a cookie-cutter yard, the HOA escalated. They issued official notices, threats of fines, and even mentioned possible legal action if the garden wasn't removed. Daniel was stunned. How could something so beautiful, something that people admired daily, be considered a problem? He tried reasoning with the board, showing them the compliments he had received from neighbors, the way children loved walking past the flowers, and how his garden actually increased property values. But the board didn't care. They had one vision of the neighborhood, and they were determined to enforce it. For Daniel, this wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about principle. He had poured years of effort into that garden, and the thought of tearing it all down because a handful of board members demanded uniformity filled him with frustration. But he wasn't the type to give in easily. If anything, the pressure from the HOA fueled his determination. Instead of backing down, he decided to double down. What began as a passion project now became his mission. Daniel expanded his garden, bringing in new plants, rare species, and unique designs. He invested in decorative arches covered in ivy, added fountains surrounded by lilies, and built a pathway of lanterns that glowed softly at night. Soon his garden was no longer just a personal retreat. It was a public spectacle. Word began to spread beyond the neighborhood. People who had heard about the forbidden garden started driving by just to catch a glimpse. Families stopped to take photos. Garden enthusiasts shared pictures online, praising Daniel's work. Before long, his home had become a local attraction, drawing in visitors from nearby communities. The HOA, however, was livid. They sent more letters, each more threatening than the last. They claimed his garden disrupted the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. They argued that the increased foot traffic was a nuisance. They even accused Daniel of bringing unwanted attention to the community. None of their tactics worked. If anything, their hostility only made Daniel more creative, more ambitious, and more determined to prove them wrong. But the tension was growing unbearable. On one side, the HOA doubled down on their threats, pushing harder than ever. On the other, Daniel's garden was gaining recognition, turning into something bigger than anyone could have imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Daniel's resolve, but the patience of the entire neighborhood. And as more people began to notice, as the garden drew more attention, something happened. that the HOA never expected. The city itself began to take notice. As Daniel's garden continued to bloom, so did its reputation. What started as whispers among neighbors quickly transformed into viral chatter across local community groups and social media. Pictures of the garden circulated online, showing cascading roses, glowing lantern paths, and arches covered in greenery. People captioned it with phrases like, "the fairy tale house," and "the garden the HOA hates." The irony that something so admired was being threatened with destruction only added fuel to the fire. Before long, weekends turned into a spectacle. Families brought their children to walk through the sidewalks outside his property, snapping photos as though it were a botanical exhibit. Amateur photographers arranged portraits in front of the colorful backdrops, and couples took engagement pictures by the flower-draped archway that framed his gate. The once quiet cul-de-sac became a hub of activity, buzzing with visitors eager to catch a glimpse of what many were now calling the best private garden in the city. But with attention came pressure. The HOA board, led by its iron-fisted president, saw the crowds as a direct challenge to their authority. They argued that the influx of people violated community peace and claimed that increased traffic was lowering the quality of life for other residents. Fines began to stack against Daniel, each letter written in the harshest tone possible. The board demanded compliance, but Daniel remained steadfast. He paid no fines, tore nothing down, and instead kept enhancing his garden, as if each flower planted was a statement of defiance. The board held meetings to address what they called the garden problem. Some residents, annoyed by the added cars and foot traffic, sided with the HOA. But many others defended Daniel, speaking passionately about how much joy his creation brought them. They argued that the garden was not a problem, but a gift, something that set their neighborhood apart. The debates grew heated, with voices raised and tempers flaring. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't in complete control. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A local newspaper picked up the story. An article titled "Man's Garden Battles HOA and Wins Hearts of the City" was published, complete with vibrant photos of Daniel's work. Within days, larger news outlets followed, and suddenly, what had been a neighborhood dispute became a citywide discussion. Talk shows debated the rights of homeowners versus the authority of HOAs. Opinion columns praised Daniel's resilience, framing him as a man who stood up against conformity and bureaucracy in the name of beauty. As the story spread, so did the visitors. What had once been dozens of people a week became hundreds. Tour buses occasionally drove by, slowing down so passengers could snap pictures. Small vendors began setting up nearby, selling snacks and drinks to curious tourists. The HOA's frustration boiled over. They weren't just dealing with a garden anymore, they were dealing with a phenomenon they couldn't control. Daniel, meanwhile, embraced the attention. He opened parts of his front yard to guided strolls, letting people admire the flowers up close. He even started hosting weekend gardening workshops, teaching families how to care for their plants. The garden was no longer just his. It had become a community project, something that united people far beyond the neighborhood. But with the rise in attention came new obstacles. Parking issues started to arise. Some neighbors, already irritated with the commotion, grew more vocal in their complaints. The HOA seized on this, trying to spin the story to the city government as a matter of safety and regulation. They demanded that officials step in to shut down what they called an unlicensed tourist attraction. For a brief moment, Daniel worried. The idea that the city might side with the HOA and force him to dismantle everything felt like a crushing possibility. He braced himself for the worst. But what happened next stunned everyone. Instead of condemning his garden, The city embraced it. Officials recognized its cultural and social value, declaring it a community landmark. They worked with Daniel to ensure proper permits were filed and safety measures put in place. Local leaders praised him for bringing beauty and tourism to the area. What the HOA had fought so hard to erase had now been legitimized by the very authority they had tried to summon against him. This recognition was more than just a win for Daniel. It was a crushing blow to the HOA. Their credibility began to crack. Residents who had once respected their rules now openly mocked their obsession with conformity. Stories of their relentless pursuit to destroy something beautiful painted them as villains, both in the neighborhood and in the media. But the fight wasn't over. The HOA president, furious at being humiliated, wasn't ready to give up. Behind closed doors, the board began plotting new ways to regain control. They looked for loopholes, for technicalities they could exploit. Rumors spread that they were preparing to launch a lawsuit, one that could drag Daniel into a legal battle designed to drain him financially and emotionally. Daniel, however, was no longer just one man fighting alone. He had the support of neighbors, the backing of the city, and the admiration of thousands who had followed his story online. Donations began pouring in from strangers who wanted to support him. Volunteers offered to help maintain the garden. Garden clubs from across the state reached out, eager to lend their expertise. What had started as a personal passion project had now grown into something bigger than Daniel ever imagined. His fight was no longer just about keeping a garden alive. It had become a symbol of resistance against petty authority, a testament to creativity and a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been told to conform when they wanted to stand out. Still, the HOA wasn't finished, and as Daniel celebrated his victories, he knew deep down that the board was preparing something drastic. The battle was far from over, and the final showdown between one man and the HOA loomed closer with every passing day. And then the lawsuit arrived. The envelope was thick, stamped with official lettering, and delivered not with a casual slip into the mailbox, but by certified mail, requiring Daniel's signature. Inside was the document he had half expected, but fully dreaded: a lawsuit from the HOA. The board, still fuming over their public humiliation and desperate to reassert authority, had taken their battle into the courtroom. The claim was long and aggressive. They accused Daniel of violating community bylaws, creating a public nuisance, lowering neighborhood safety, and even endangering property values. It was clear their real motive wasn't safety or order, it was revenge. The HOA president, who had made Daniel's garden his personal crusade, wanted to crush him completely. For the first time since this battle began, Daniel felt the weight of fear. Lawsuits weren't like fines or angry letters. They carried real consequences, draining money, time, and energy. He wondered if the board's strategy was to bleed him dry until he had no choice but to surrender. But just as doubt began to creep in, Daniel remembered something important. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The news of the lawsuits spread quickly. Local media outlets covered it as the garden on trial. Comment sections filled with outrage at the HOA's tactics, with strangers rallying behind Daniel. Donations from supporters poured in, and a local law firm even offered to represent him pro bono, recognizing the case as an opportunity to challenge the unchecked power of HOAs. What the board intended as an overwhelming attack was quickly turning into a public relations disaster for them. The courtroom hearings began, and while the HOA expected an easy victory, they were unprepared for the amount of attention the trial attracted. Journalists filled the gallery. Neighbors lined up to testify on Daniel's behalf, speaking passionately about how the garden brought joy and pride to the community. Families recounted stories of children learning about plants during visits. Photographers described how the garden had become a creative haven, and city officials praised the space as a recognized cultural landmark. The HOA, meanwhile, stuck to their rigid arguments. They insisted that Daniel had violated bylaws requiring uniformity of appearance. They exaggerated claims of disruption, citing the occasional traffic jam or parked car as evidence of chaos. Their president, red-faced and defiant, painted Daniel not as a gardener but as a reckless agitator bent on destroying order. But every argument they made seemed smaller compared to the beauty and positivity the garden had created. Their obsession with conformity looked petty under the bright lights of public scrutiny. Their claims of harm looked flimsy against the overwhelming testimony of joy and admiration. The turning point came when Daniel's lawyers presented data showing property values in the neighborhood had actually risen since the garden gained fame. Real estate experts testified that homes near unique landmarks often sold faster and for higher prices. Far from harming the community, the garden had enhanced it. The HOA's central argument collapsed in front of everyone's eyes. Weeks of hearings culminated in the judge's ruling. With a firm tone, the court dismissed the HOA's lawsuit, declaring that Daniel's garden did not violate any enforceable law or bylaw, and that it posed no legitimate harm to the community. The ruling emphasized the right of homeowners to express individuality within reason, especially when such expression enriched the cultural and social fabric of the area. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Daniel felt a surge of relief wash over him. He had not only defended his garden, but also set a precedent, one that could inspire countless others facing the same battles with overreaching HOAs. The HOA board, on the other hand, sat in stunned silence. Their grand attempt to destroy him had ended in a very public defeat. But the fallout was just beginning. Within weeks of the ruling, residents began openly questioning the legitimacy of the HOA board. Petitions circulated calling for the resignation of the president and several board members. Meetings turned hostile as angry neighbors demanded accountability for the thousands of dollars wasted on a lawsuit that accomplished nothing but embarrassment. Eventually, under immense pressure, the HOA president resigned in disgrace, his name forever tied to one of the most notorious neighborhood disputes in recent memory. Daniel, meanwhile, was free to tend to his garden without fear, free to expand his vision, and free to share it with anyone who wished to see it. With the lawsuit behind him, he focused on building something even greater. The city partnered with him to organize seasonal garden festivals, drawing visitors from across the state. Local schools arranged field trips where children could learn about botany, conservation, and the joy of nurturing life. What had begun as one man's personal sanctuary was now a landmark, a symbol of resilience and creativity. Tourists came with cameras, artists came with sketchbooks, and families came with wide-eyed children eager to explore. The garden was no longer just Daniel's. It belonged to everyone who found inspiration in its beauty. For Daniel, the victory wasn't just about winning against the HOA, it was about proving that individuality could triumph over conformity, that beauty could outweigh bureaucracy, and that sometimes the boldest acts of defiance came in the form of planting a seed and letting it grow. The HOA had tried to uproot his garden. Instead, they had unwittingly helped it flourish into something legendary. And as Daniel looked out over the rows of flowers swaying gently in the breeze, he knew the fight had been worth every sleepless night, every threatening letter, every court date, because in the end, the garden didn't just survive, it became immortal. And so, The man who was once told to tear down his garden now stood as its proud caretaker, watching as visitors from far and wide walked through his gates, marveling at the sight of a place born not out of permission, but out of passion, persistence, and the refusal to give in to those who tried to silence beauty. The HOA had tried to erase him. Instead, they had helped him write a story that would be told for years. The garden that the HOA hated had become the garden that everyone loved.